Thanks, Monica. Listen, thanks to all the contributors, and I know time's against us, and we could talk all day as with the judge in terms of his presentation too. I just wanted, following on and what Andre was saying about, the gender issue, I'd like you maybe to expand a wee bit on secondary harms, linked into actually what Alex said about, the support from his wife. So a bit on that would be important in terms of that. Thanks.
Did you understand that? The gender issue? Yeah. Okay, we've got that. Then further back, there are a couple of women who put their hands up. Great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Natasha, and I'm a lecturer in human rights law at Queen's. A question that I have for anybody who would like to address it is essentially how much... Sure, yes, definitely. I was wondering how much you value the force of the law in bringing about real change and effective sort of remedies in a deeper sense for victims of grave violations, or whether you feel that there are limits to what the law can achieve, what legal judgments can achieve, and other initiatives need to be prioritized and emphasized in this context. Because sometimes I feel that we get quite complacent as lawyers in thinking, well, the law has spoken and that gives effective remedies to individuals. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Is there someone near that we can hand the microphone to? There is. Great. Thank you.
I would just like Andrea to clarify, she said about civilians being the innocent victims. Are you saying then that the security forces that were murdered and injured are not innocent victims?
By that. And then towards the back, and then we'll come back down towards the front. Is there anybody at the back? I think somebody had their hand up at the back.
William Fraser from South Armagh. Just a couple of points I would like to ask. Alan, you said about the Eames Bradley and a couple of other issues and about the politicians not coming up to the mark. The reasons the politicians can't come up to the mark is because the people are saying no. That's the reality. The majority of the victims that certainly we've been involved with, and like us or hate us, we do represent a large number of victims, and they have said to their politicians, no, it is not acceptable. And there seems to be a perception out there that everything's hunky-dory from the representation of the victims. It is far from it. People like ourselves is not represented, and with a great respect to everybody in the planet, but my views and people who feel like me are not represented on that panel. And I know somebody will say you had the opportunity. Well, the reason I didn't take it was because I knew we'd be exactly where we are today, nowhere.
And then the microphone should come down here to the front, right down to the front.
Thank you. I'm Nick Taylor from the Tim Parry Jonathan Ball Foundation for Peace in Warrington, Cheshire. 2,000 people were killed, 2,000 people were injured, 17% of those killed as part of the Troubles. An estimated 350,000 people served in the security forces. I come to a lot of events in Northern Ireland, in the north and the south, and I don't see anybody representing those victims and those people on the panel, and I wonder what this panel thinks about their role in the peace process, and should they be represented here at events like this?
We're going to have a rattle at trying to respond to each of these. We'll start with Mark's, which is on the issue of gender. Do you want to add something? Anyone on that? Andrea, was there something that you...
In terms of that issue of secondary harms, in fact, the judge talked a little bit about that idea that we have, especially in our way of looking at dealing with the past, we have focused very much on investigating the circumstances in which individuals were killed. And what that leaves out then is the harm that was done to those who survived. The people who survived experience a harm. And I think that we have neglected that, where we treat the women who were in the homes, who saw their loved ones being killed in their homes, as eyewitnesses, rather than as people who suffered a harm themselves. People who are engaged for over 30 years in inquests and seeking disclosure from the different agencies who were responsible for the harm are enduring a harm as they are going through that. So they haven't experienced a secondary harm. They're not merely a next of kin. They are people who experience a harm in themselves. And I think it's something that's very underexplored. I think it's very gendered, with 91% of those killed being men. There's an obvious corollary implication in that. So I think that we need to come to some sort of understanding. Is it all right, rather than me hugging it, that I address the innocent thing?
Yeah,
now?
go ahead. You can take another issue.
If I use the word innocent, it was certainly unintentionally, because I certainly don't want to go down that road. I think I may have talked about people who didn't make a choice, who were harmed during our conflict, and that is a distinction that's there. And of course I didn't, in my rush, mention non-state actors who of course have experienced harm and of course have issues of reparation as well. And we don't engage in those issues because we engage in a very convenient conversation rather than a difficult conversation. So I certainly didn't want to I didn't want to draw a legitimacy argument at all. I want to engage in who has needs and how we as a society meet those needs, because I think that's where we need to be at, whether it's through the legal processes, whether it's through reparatory processes, and we need to, in response, we need to develop our legal frameworks to ensure that we encompass the range of needs. Sometimes law can be quite blind to harms, and I think that we need to develop our understanding. And it's people like Alec, it's people like the people in this room who can ensure that legal processes ensure accountability, inclusion, and address those issues of discrimination.
Thank you. On the issue of the force of law and the limitations to legal judgments, again, I would defer to the Honourable Judge on this, but I think your point is well made, that the courts can only do so much, and often you will hear, in your case you're talking about victims of sexual violence, often saying, if that was a court of law, it wasn't a court of justice. So it's a good point, and obviously in the workshops it may be taken up and discussed further.
Yeah, just on Willie's point about Eames Bradley and about the fact that the victim said no. Absolutely, I have absolutely no truck with that at all. I know there were victims out there that said no. My issue was that, you know, there isn't one victim's voice in this society. There isn't. There are victims that said no, there are victims that said yes, and there are victims that couldn't care less. And when I'm listening to debates on the radio and I hear people coming on and saying things like, and Willie would be one of them, that the innocent victims think this and the innocent victims think that, well, you know what? I'm an innocent victim and I don't agree. So there you are. And I'm sure that I'm not the only one. I'm sure there's others out there, and if you were to canvass opinion, I'm sure that's what would come back to you. So this nonsense that there's one victim's voice out there, I think absolutely needs to be exposed.
That was the response, and if I cannot, Willie, you can talk to Alan and to me at the break time. And in relation to that, I think there has been many discussions around who is the victim, the diversity amongst victims, and the diversity amongst victims' needs. And again, it would be good to hear this in the workshop. And now I'm going to ask my panel, because we've responded to all of the points, and your point is well made at the front, in relation to those from elsewhere in Great Britain and indeed the Republic of Ireland. Alex, do you want to say anything? Okay.
Just general response to a few of the questions. Obviously very interesting to hear the focus on women, and that would be exactly what I've found in Mid-Ulster. But what I would say is I would like to see a greater emphasis on the really good stuff and the really good work and the power of our children and our young people who are going to have to be the future for us no matter what way we look at it. And I know that certainly in my perspective, obviously coming from an educational background and having two children myself, a lot of the work that we're doing is, yes, we're dealing with mopping up the past and we're mopping up the issues that are being created through the media and all, on a daily basis. But the big thing is about how can we move these people to a better place? How can we get our young children to be able to stand up and say, no, I do not want that violence. I do not want that terrorism. I do not want that in my community. I don't want that paramilitary group. So that's a very important thing that I think, as well as the women, I think we should be looking at what the children do. In relation to the law, you're quite right. At the end of the day, you know, one of the things about court cases and any of our families that have gone through it, it is a very traumatic thing. It is a very difficult arena to be in, and it is a tricky place to be able to do your work. So yes, if there are other ways of doing it, but let's be clear, there has to be a clear difference between people who committed acts of violence and killed people and murdered people. Perpetrators and victims are two different things, and that is clear to me and the hundreds of people I work with, not only in Ulster, but right across Northern Ireland. I'd like to feed in this gentleman's comment here about having no voice in the GB. There is nobody. My wife, us all, we fully are involved in the issues in relation to mainland provision, and we realise that at the end of the day, if people in the mainland were over here, or people in the mainland who suffered as a result of what was going on here, well, I believe that they should be looked after exactly the same as anybody else, and that includes the VSS. The VSS should be standing up and saying, you were hurt, your injuries, your mental, your physical are exactly the same. And finally, sort of fill in to Willie's point. Obviously, I'd be disappointed if Willie didn't think I was able to sort of in some way understand where he's coming from. I think Mid-Ulster and South Armagh suffered greatly in similar ways. But in relation to the Haas talks, no surprise to me that the Haas talks failed. I was with Mr Haas when he told me, I'll get you truth and you'll not need justice. Well, I know that the people I work with, that is simply not true. So feeding back to Willie's point, that people were saying no. It wasn't that people were saying no, because that's what we get in this country, that certain people just say no because that's all they can do. They were saying no for a good reason. So as I say...
But only some of them, Jeff.
Yeah, exactly. But some people who were saying no were saying for a good reason.
It will be 2 seconds. Okay.
I would just like to say on the point from Mark, you know, severely injured people, their wives or their carers or whoever it is, the people who look after them, they're very important within this, because the day that you're injured and severely injured or blew up or whatever it may be, them people, lives changes, your life changes, your family's life changes. They have to look after the severely injured person until they die or die first, you know what I mean? So the women, most of them's women, and I think that we owe them a great debt of gratitude, especially from, you know, us as their loved ones, and as a society, we owe them a debt. And to talk about victims, when you're talking about victims, the problem with victims is victims can't get on with each other. See, if we could get on with each other, we would be a great voice that people would listen to. But unfortunately, we have this tic-tac fight with each other, shooting at each other, and that should not happen. We're all victims of the troubles. Move on. Let's get on with it.
And one of the good things about this conference, Judge, which you may not be aware of, is it was probably not possible to put this panel together and to have this respectful conversation 15 years ago. So in some senses, we have most certainly moved on. But it's equally true to note, as Alex said, and who would expect it to be any different, that it's not in a homogenous group. Different victims, as we've said, need different things. And I think that's also a point that has been well respected. So on that point, I would like you to thank our panel for their contributions today.